Hey there folks, welcome to video number 8. This one is a brief review of the American Civil War from 1860 to 1865. This isn't going to get into too many specifics about military battles and things like that. This is just a general overview of the causes, the results, the people, and some of the battles, some of the key battles in this war. So let's get started. First of all, a summary of all the effects of the war. This photo to the right is from one of the battlefields, I believe from one of the battles at Gettysburg. And so you can see from this picture alone how devastating and gory this battle was. And that gives you a sense of how many dead there were. You had over 600,000 dead and missing by the end of the war. The higher percentage of the dead came from the Confederate side. They started with fewer men in their armies, and so when they lost a lot of men, almost as many as the Union Army, that was obviously a higher percentage of their soldiers. You had over 500,000 who were wounded, who lost limbs. And this isn't even counting soldiers who had psychological trauma, emotional trauma, what we would consider today post-traumatic stress disorder. You also had 4 million newly freed African Americans who had resided in slave states, most of which were in the Confederacy. What were they going to do with their lives and their new freedom? This war also strengthened the economic and political power of the northern states, the victorious states, and the United States government. On the other side, for the Confederacy, it devastated every aspect of life in the South, their economy, their government, their society. It destroyed it and completely changed it for new. So what were the causes? Well, cause number one, without a doubt, is slavery. Never believe anybody who tells you that slavery was not the driving force behind the Civil War. It absolutely was. This arguments about slavery had been going on since the United States existed, actually before the United States even existed, going all the way back to the first remember Bacon's Rebellion, when you saw a sharp increase in the number of slaves in the American colonies. But since the founding of the United States, the arguments over slavery had continued and intensified. Remember the Three-Fifths Compromise that had come into existence? And as the nation grew in size and people, this arguing about where slavery should be and should slavery even be allowed in the United States, it became more heated and became more violent. You had examples like Bleeding Kansas, where there were arguments over whether Kansas was going to be a slave state or a free state, and people fought each other in the years leading up to the Civil War. Harper's Ferry, where John Brown and several supporters tried to seize a federal arsenal and cause a slave uprising. And then even here in D.C., on the floor of the Senate, in the Capitol building, you had a Southern senator take his cane and beat Senator Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, beat him over the head on the floor of the Senate. So violence was everywhere, out west, in the Eastern Shore, and even in D.C. in the Capitol building. So the government tried to pass compromises that would please the slave states and the non-slave states, and this would solve the problem for a little bit, but then the argument would begin again. So compromise only took us so far. Some of the more well-known compromises were the Missouri Compromise from back in 1819, 1820. You had the Compromise of 1850, which came after the Mexican-American War, and then you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then you had a Supreme Court case that was critical to causing the Civil War, and that was Dred Scott versus Sanford. This further divided the nation because it basically said that no state and even Congress could not outlaw slavery. Therefore, slavery could exist wherever any slave owner wanted to take their slaves. And this angered a lot of people. You also had regional differences. In the North, you had a lot of industry. You had large numbers of immigrants coming from Ireland, from Germany, from Western Europe. And in the West, you had folks coming from China, coming from Asia. Meanwhile, in the South, you had a much wider population with fewer immigrants, and so the basis for labor were poor whites or slaves. And their economy was driven by slavery and by agriculture. Plantation owners, who made up a minority of the population, they controlled the local politics, though, because of their power, because of their wealth. And so they really controlled the culture in the South. So then came the election of 1860, and in this election we saw Abraham Lincoln win. He was the first Republican to be elected president, and the Republican Party at this time wasn't even 10 years old. They were a very new party, founded on with the idea of ending the spread of slavery. But Abraham Lincoln won as a minority president. He only had 40% of the popular vote. Only 40% of voters had actually voted for him. So he was a minority president. He did not have a majority. And he was Republican, which angered a lot of the southern states because he wanted to limit the spread of slavery. And so southern states, or slave states, saw this as a threat to their way of life, to the end of slavery. And so, before Lincoln was even sworn in as president, states began to secede. South Carolina was the first to secede. Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. South Carolina voted to secede, not succeed, but secede, or politically separate themselves from the United States, in December. So again, months before Lincoln even was sworn in as president. He had only been elected. South Carolina was soon joined by 10 other southern slaveholding states. And when you look at this map on the right, the states that are in light blue, they stayed with the Union. They stayed with the United States. The states in gray became Confederate states. And the states in green, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, they stayed with the Union, but they were still slave states. And you'll notice that D.C., where D.C. is located, is right smack dab between Maryland, which was a border state, and Virginia. And West Virginia came into existence during the Civil War because that was a part of Virginia where there weren't very many slaves, and the whites who lived in that area, the occupants, really didn't want to leave the Union. And so they actually voted to leave Virginia and form their own state, West Virginia, during the Civil War. Fighting soon began in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And after that, the war truly began. The first battle on the ground was in Virginia at the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, which is a short drive just outside of D.C. Speaking of notable battles, Fort Sumter was the first that started all, and then you had the first land battle, which was Manassas or Bull Run. Some other important ones. You had Antietam in 1862. This is, even to this day, the bloodiest day in American history, with 4,000 soldiers killed and 23,000 casualties total. So that includes those killed and those wounded. That was in a single day. You also had Gettysburg in 1863. This is the bloodiest battle of the war that lasted several days, and it was the last serious attempt by the Confederate forces to invade the North. You also had Vicksburg, which concluded the same time as Gettysburg in 1863. This battle gave the Union Army control of the Mississippi River, which meant that the Confederacy was split in half geographically. Atlanta in 1864. This was a critical city for the Confederacy, and when it was captured, it divided the Confederacy again and made it impossible for them to ship supplies to their armies. And finally, Richmond in 1865. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and it was finally captured by the Union Army in April of 1865. And then the largest Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, surrendered shortly after Richmond was captured in 1865 at Appomattox, a small town in southwest Virginia. So some notable people in the Civil War that you may have heard of besides President Lincoln. You had Robert E. Lee. He was the top Confederate general. You may have heard of his name because I went to Washington and Lee University. Robert E. Lee was president of that university after the Civil War and is buried on the campus. Robert E. Lee has also been in the news a lot because of statues around the United States to him that people have been demanding that they be torn down, and some of them have been taken down in places like New Orleans, Louisiana. So a lot of controversy about Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant was the top Union general, and he would later be president. He led the Union Army that began to turn the tide and win the war for the United States. Then you had Frederick Douglass. He pushed for the ending of slavery and helped convince Abraham Lincoln to write the Emancipation Proclamation, and he also pushed for the recruitment of African-American soldiers, including his two sons. Then you had women who played very active roles, very notable roles in the Civil War. Two in particular were Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix. Both were women nurses, and they helped provide medical supplies to soldiers, to the Union Army, and they helped with locating and identifying dead soldiers. Clara Barton played a critical role in that, and her office was right here in D.C. So here's a picture of Robert E. Lee in his Confederate uniform. Here's a picture of Ulysses S. Grant in his Union uniform. Here, of course, is Frederick Douglass. And this is Clara Barton. And in fact, if you go downtown in Chinatown in DC, you can see the office where she worked to help locate and identify dead soldiers after the war had ended, so families would know where and what had happened to their loved ones. So one of the most important documents, most important events that did not happen on a battlefield was the Emancipation Proclamation. This was issued in 1862 after the Union Army supposedly won the Battle of Antietam. So it was issued in 1862, but it took effect on January 1st, 1863. And what it actually did was it freed all the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, all the Confederate states. It did not free slaves in states that were still part of the Union, states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Slavery still existed in those states. One other, in fact, a more critical thing that it did was it allowed for the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. This would mean that hundreds of thousands of African American men would be able to enlist in the Union Army and help turn the tide in their favor. However, they did have to form separate regiments, and the officers were going to be white, but nevertheless, they had a major impact. They made up a total of 10% of all the soldiers in the Union Army, a good chunk of those soldiers. And even though they were only 10% of the Army, they had a higher fatality rate than white soldiers for several reasons. First of all, many times they were put in very dangerous situations, so they were basically used as human fodder. Another reason is because they fought harder. They felt they had much more to fight for because they were fighting for their own freedom and to free those that they loved. So the end of the war came about in 1865. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered at Appomattox, and soon after, other Confederate forces surrendered instead of going off into the hills and the mountains and fighting a guerrilla war, which they could have done, but they did not. Lincoln was soon assassinated, like a week after, not even a week after Lee surrendered. He was assassinated right here in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater. April 14th, and then he died in the morning of the 15th, right across the street in Peterson House in 1865. So another end of the war was it settled the question of the superiority of the federal government over state governments, although it wasn't total. There were still arguments about what rights the states had versus the national government. And there are debates about this to this day. But for the time being, it settled the question over who was dominant, the national government or state governments, and whether or not a state could secede from the United States. The Republican Party and Northern politicians would go on to dominate national politics for several decades following the Civil War. In fact, the next president to come from a Southern state would be Woodrow Wilson, and that wouldn't be until 1912. The Southern states, as mentioned previously, were physically, economically, politically, and spiritually crushed. Hundreds of thousands of their men had died. Their families were left distraught. Physically, the landscape had changed. The Union Army had marched through places like Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, and had burned cities down, had taken down trees, had taken supplies, burned down farms. Slaves, the African Americans, were now free. So a lot of these people who had depended on slave labor suddenly had to find some other way to manage their farms and run their farms. And the former slaves were happy to be free, but they weren't really sure what the future held for them. Many tried to find lost family members who'd been sold away or had otherwise vanished. Others headed north, and others really weren't sure what to do. They enjoyed their freedom, but they were going to have a hard time trying to figure out what they could do, and they were going to find their opportunities limited by the whites who were still in power in the South. And that time period that was going to follow the war was Reconstruction, which we'll get to in video 9. And Reconstruction saw many advantages and saw many opportunities for African Americans and for the United States, but nevertheless fell short of what our goals were and what could have been at the end of Reconstruction. So thanks for watching. Tune into video 9, which will be a brief review of Reconstruction, and I will see you all in class.